It doesn't feel like decline. The streets of Manhattan still buzz. U.S. tech companies still lead in innovation. American media still dominates the narrative. And yet, something deeper is shifting. Quietly, systematically. This isn't collapse. It's erosion. Slow, strategic, and largely unspoken. The real question isn't whether America is still powerful. It is. The question is, how much of that power is still structural, and how much is simply momentum? From international trade negotiations to the expanding influence of the BRICS bloc, we're beginning to see the architecture of global power take on a new form, one where the United States is no longer the undisputed center. But few want to admit it because the signs aren't always loud. They're subtle. A trade agreement here, a digital infrastructure project there, a new payment system being tested in Asia, and over time, those subtle shifts create a new reality. One where the old empire looks intact on the surface, but its control has already been rerouted. And make no mistake, the U.S. still leads in many ways. But lead what, exactly? And for how long, if the world around it begins to choose different rules, different systems, and different partners? That's the question we're unpacking today. Is this truly the fall of the American empire? And why isn't anyone admitting it? Not from a place of panic, not from ideology, but from strategy. Because the world isn't turning upside down, it's just rotating, slowly, towards something more complex, more distributed, and potentially more balanced. And before we dive in, if you're someone who values this kind of geopolitical insight, clean, strategic, and grounded in data, then subscribe to the channel. This is where we decode global wealth, one power shift at a time. For most of the 20th century, if a country wanted access to global markets, there was one door that mattered: Washington. Through its control of the IMF, the World Bank, and the dominance of the U.S. dollar, America wasn't just a participant in global trade, it was the arbiter of it. But today, we're seeing something unprecedented. Entire regions building parallel systems, quietly exiting the old playbook. In Latin America, new trade corridors bypass U.S. ports entirely. In Africa, Chinese-led infrastructure projects are linking resource zones with global buyers, without a single American signature involved. And in Asia, cross-border payment systems are emerging that no longer rely on the SWIFT network or dollar settlement. These aren't theories. They're new rules in motion. The term de-dollarization used to feel like a fringe concept. Today, it's a boardroom discussion in countries like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and even India. Why? Because these economies are no longer content being price takers. They want a seat at the table, or better yet, to build their own. And this isn't just economic policy. It's strategy. Control the pipes, ports, currencies, logistics, and you control who gets what, when, and at what cost. That's the real power behind trade. And increasingly, that power is multipolar. Here's the twist. America's trade footprint is still massive, but the influence that came with it, the ability to set the terms, the timelines, and the rules, is what's slipping. That's what no one's admitting. Because influence doesn't vanish overnight. It fades, quietly, until one day you realize you're negotiating in someone else's system. Let's move on to the next subject, where this quiet rebalancing gets even more pronounced. In the realm of currency trust. For decades, the U.S. dollar has been more than just paper. It's been a symbol of stability, trust, and power. In fact, 90% of global trade transactions have historically been touched by it, even if the U.S. wasn't directly involved. But lately, that silent dominance is being questioned in boardrooms, not battlefields. Quietly, systematically, and not just by economic rivals, but by former allies too. Let's start with a subtle but powerful shift: bilateral trade deals that skip the dollar entirely. India and the UAE, two major economic hubs, now settle part of their oil transactions in rupees. Brazil and China, once deeply entrenched in dollar-based settlements, are exploring the yuan. Even the ASEAN nations have proposed frameworks to reduce dollar reliance in regional trade. Now ask yourself, if global players begin settling trade without the dollar, what happens to the demand for U.S. debt? What happens to America's ability to borrow cheaply? But here's where it gets more interesting. The rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Over 130 countries, representing 98% of the global GDP, are now experimenting with or launching their own digital currencies. These tools allow direct settlement, real-time clearing, and sovereign control, with no need for a dollar intermediary. It's a subtle shift in plumbing, not just policy. And once that infrastructure exists, it's very hard to go back. Now let's be clear. The dollar isn't collapsing, but its automatic supremacy is fading. In a world where digital networks, localized trade systems, and multipolar partnerships are emerging, the dollar is no longer the default. It's becoming a choice, and fewer nations are choosing it without questioning the cost. Let's talk about something that rarely makes headlines, but quietly determines a nation's long-term strength: its internal balance sheet. While the world debates influence, tech, and trade routes, the United States faces a challenge that can't be solved with diplomacy or innovation. A structurally unsustainable economic model built on mounting debt and persistent deficits. Right now, the U.S. national debt has surpassed $34 trillion, a figure so large it defies imagination. But the number isn't the problem. The trajectory is. Every year, the U.S. spends far more than it earns, not just in economic downturns, but even during periods of growth. That means deficits aren't a response to crisis. They're baked into the system. Historically, demand for U.S. Treasury bonds has never been a concern. Global institutions, sovereign funds, and central banks lined up for them. Why? Because they were considered the safest asset on Earth. But what happens when global confidence begins to erode? When alternatives emerge? When governments ask, why lend money to a system that can't restrain its own spending? Here's the uncomfortable truth. America's economic engine now depends on being trusted, not on being balanced. And if that trust slips, borrowing gets more expensive. Inflation risk rises. The dollar gets tested. And suddenly, the entire machine, trade, consumption, global influence, begins to wobble. Add to that the long-term costs of entitlement programs, aging demographics, and political gridlock, and you begin to see why some analysts now refer to this model as structural fragility. Not collapse, not chaos, just gradual erosion that compounds over time. Comment the word "more" if you're starting to see how all these pieces are connected. Because up next, we'll look at how emerging alliances, from BRICS to the Belt and Road, are quietly building a parallel system, one that doesn't just compete with the West, but increasingly ignores it. While the U.S. debates its debt ceiling and replays old economic formulas, a new system is being quietly engineered, not in secret, but often in plain sight. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, once considered an experimental acronym, have evolved into a serious alternative platform for global coordination. And what they're building isn't just symbolic, it's functional, strategic, and gaining traction fast. The clearest evidence? The push for settling trade in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar entirely. In 2024 alone, India and the UAE executed multi-million-dollar oil transactions in rupees. Brazil and China agreed to trade in their own currencies. And Russia, under heavy sanctions, has accelerated the development of alternative payment systems that exclude SWIFT, the very infrastructure that has long upheld dollar dominance. This isn't about rebellion, It's about reducing risk. Because when the global financial system is so heavily concentrated in one currency, controlled by one central bank, subject to one country's domestic policy, other nations start looking for options. And BRICS offers one, a framework for cooperation that isn't dictated by Washington or Brussels. But it doesn't stop there. Infrastructure investments through the New Development Bank, expansion talks with countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and even digital currency experiments all point to one thing. BRICS isn't just reacting to U.S. policies. It's building a parallel ecosystem with its own logic, tools, and priorities. What makes this shift so significant is that it doesn't require a dramatic confrontation. It's a quiet rebalancing. The more countries participate, the less dependent they become on the existing system. And the more they trade, invest, and innovate outside the old framework, the less they feel the need to return to it. This, more than any single headline, may be the clearest sign that we are entering a truly multipolar world. One where influence is no longer enforced. It's earned through relevance. Now let's turn to something even more unsettling: the quiet collapse of soft power. What happens when a nation's influence no longer inspires but repels? For decades, the strength of the American empire wasn't just about economics or military projection, it was about soft power. Hollywood, Harvard, Silicon Valley, Coca-Cola. These were the cultural exports that shaped global imagination, drew in talent, and made the American dream a global aspiration. But in recent years, that glow has begun to dim. And it's not just about anti-American sentiment, it's about alternatives. The world is changing, and so is its cultural gravity. Platforms like TikTok have redefined global entertainment from Beijing. Dubai is emerging as a new magnet for entrepreneurs and influencers. European universities, Indian tech hubs, even Nigerian music scenes are rising. And as people around the world gain access to broader sources of media, information, and education, the dominance of American content, and by extension, American values, is no longer assumed. Now pause for a second. Because this shift in cultural and intellectual preference isn't just symbolic. It impacts everything from where the best talent migrates to which platforms dominate tech innovation, to how trust is distributed in an interconnected world. In 2023, the U.S. saw a notable drop in international student enrollment for the first time in years. Meanwhile, countries like Canada, Australia, and Germany surged. When your appeal fades, so does your ability to shape the future conversation. What's more, skepticism is growing toward the institutions once considered the gold standard. The IMF, the World Bank, even US-based NGOs are increasingly viewed with suspicion in parts of the global South. The perception isn't necessarily hostility. It's irrelevance. In their place, new players and platforms are rising, and they speak the languages, share the struggles, and reflect the ambitions of a broader world. So if soft power once meant setting the tone for global progress, its erosion signals something more profound. It's not just about being liked, it's about being looked to. And in more and more regions, that spotlight is shifting. Quietly, consistently, and without asking for permission. Let's move on, because sometimes it's not the headlines that reveal the truth. It's the infrastructure quietly crumbling beneath them. If you want to understand the future of influence, don't just watch the headlines, follow the cables, ports, and pipelines. The physical world is where empires rise and fall, and today, the map is quietly being redrawn. Over the last decade, the U.S. has invested trillions in digital platforms, finance, and defense innovation, but far less in global-scale infrastructure. Meanwhile, BRICS-aligned nations have been laying down roads, rails, and fiber optic lines that tell a very different story. China's Belt and Road Initiative, India's growing tech corridors, Russia's Arctic energy routes, Brazil's agri-exports pipeline to Asia, and South Africa's push for green logistics. And they aren't happening with US financing or design. In fact, many of these deals bypass Western institutions entirely, forming a new ecosystem of logistics, financing, and connectivity. That matters, because infrastructure isn't just about getting from A to B. It's about determining who controls the routes, who sets the prices, and who benefits from the flow of global commerce. Take digital infrastructure as an example. While American companies still dominate legacy tech markets, new undersea cables are increasingly funded and controlled by BRICS nations. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Starlink might offer one option, but Chinese-funded 5G towers and local satellite networks are quickly becoming the backbone of everyday connectivity. In short, the lanes of the future are being built, and the US is not always in the driver's seat. And here's the bigger picture. Infrastructure has long-term consequences. Whoever builds it often sets the rules for decades. That's why the quiet buildup of BRICS-aligned supply chains, logistics hubs, and digital highways may be more significant than any policy speech or trade agreement. Because in geopolitics, whoever lays the foundation often writes the future, even if no one's paying attention yet. Let's turn the lens to something few dare to discuss: the rise of parallel power structures that no longer wait for Washington's permission. Something subtle but historic is happening in global governance. For decades, the world revolved around institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and G7, all heavily influenced by US leadership. But today, a parallel architecture is emerging. Quietly, persistently, and without dramatic announcements, BRICS nations have been building alternatives. The new development bank, cross-border payment systems, regional reserve mechanisms, currency swap agreements. These aren't just bureaucratic tools, they're the plumbing of a new financial era. And while they're not replacing the old system overnight, they're reducing dependence on it. That's a crucial difference. In 2024, Brazil and China conducted nearly 40% of their trade in yuan. India has expanded its use of the rupee for energy purchases. Russia, sanctioned and isolated, is deepening its integration into non-dollar settlements. And the result? A slow-motion diversification away from the US dollar's central role, not with defiance, but with quiet strategy. Here's the part no one's admitting. These systems are becoming increasingly functional. The new development bank has already financed over $30 billion in infrastructure and social projects. While small compared to the World Bank, it's growing. And more importantly, it signals a mindset shift. The Global South is no longer just asking for a seat at the table. It's building its own table. That doesn't mean the old order collapses overnight, but it does mean the monopoly on influence is breaking. And why does this matter for the so-called fall of an empire? Because power is no longer measured only by fleets or flags. It's measured by how many systems run through you. Financial ones, legal ones, technological ones. When the center of gravity shifts, even gradually, the world adjusts. Sometimes without fanfare, sometimes before most people even notice. But when enough pieces are built outside the old framework, the game begins to change. Quietly, irreversibly. And that's exactly what's happening. So, is this the fall of the American empire? The truth is, it doesn't look like how Hollywood imagined it. There's no dramatic collapse, no catastrophic ending. What we're witnessing is far more complex and far more strategic. It's a redistribution of influence, a global rebalancing, a gradual rewiring of the systems that once centered around a single power. And while no one is sounding the alarm in public, behind the scenes, nations are adjusting, investors are adapting, alliances are recalibrating, and yes, power is being quietly redefined. This is why we chose to ask the uncomfortable question out loud, because the signs are visible, but often ignored. And in today's global economy, ignoring structural shifts is the most dangerous thing a person or a country can do. Trade is being rerouted. Infrastructure is being repurposed. And the world's most influential voices are starting to speak in many accents, not just one. Whether you see this as a fall, a transition, or a necessary correction, the consequences will affect every supply chain, every investment, every market forecast you'll read in the next decade. So now it's your turn. What do you see happening next? Will this multipolar shift accelerate or stall? Will the US reinvent itself again, as it has before? Or are we witnessing something new? The quiet evolution of an empire into just another player at the table? Leave a comment below with your perspective. And if this video challenged your thinking, make sure to check out this video, subscribe to the channel, where we decode global wealth, one shift at a time. We have more videos coming that will explore how these global realignments are reshaping energy, trade, and tech innovation across the world. Thanks for watching. And remember, history doesn't repeat, but it does shift in patterns. Stay aware, stay strategic, and we'll see you in the next one.